Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I would like to review The Merry Wives of Windsor by William Shakespeare.
Non più tra i farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno d'intorno girano, delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto Adolgino d'amor. Delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto Adolgino d'amor.
So, as some of you may know, one of my goals for 2021 was to read the last remaining Shakespeare plays that I have not yet read. And The Merry Wives of Windsor is the first of those 8 that I was able to read. So I thought I'd take a few moments and talk to you about my thoughts. So legend has it that The Merry Wives of Windsor was written at Queen Elizabeth's request. It's rumored that she told Shakespeare that she wanted to see Sir John Falstaff in love, and thus The Merry Wives of Windsor was born. You may recognize Sir John Falstaff from the Henriade, being Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. So this was his last appearance in the dramatic canon. So Elizabethan audiences, and indeed many readers and audiences today, will go in with a preconceived notion of what to expect from Sir John Falstaff. They know that he is supposed to be fat and jolly and a bit of a thief. The idea that he is fat is often made fun of in all of these plays, but it does display 2 notable aspects of his character. On the one hand, it represents such things as sloth and greed and indolence, which indeed Falstaff displays on many occasions. But on the other hand, his fatness represents life and enjoyment of all the good things in life, of food, good wine, women, and the joy that that brings. And that is often the reason why many characters are attracted to him in the first place. He often tends to have too good an opinion of himself, and his tendency to lie to get himself what he wants can often also get himself into trouble. Yet he always manages to charm his way out of it. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, we find him at a loose end, really. He whips out 2 love letters that he has composed to Mistress Ford and Mistress Page, 2 noted married women in the local area, being Windsor. And he sends them out because he is convinced that both women have shown him signs of favor, and so he is determined to set out and woo them both. Despite the fact that they are not widowed, they are in fact still married. That just poses itself as an extra challenge to him. When Mistress Ford and Mistress Page receive these letters, they are very affronted, outraged, and they happen to talk to one another. And they compare the letters and realize exactly what Falstaff is trying to pull. So they decide, with the help of their friend Mistress Quickly, who you will also recognize from the Henriade, that they are going to play along, but use every opportunity to make a fool out of Falstaff and prove that he cannot just woo them just because he feels like it. In true Shakespearean fashion, there are also subplots, one of which being Mr. Ford, who is equally outraged at Falstaff's attempts to seduce his wife, and his jealousy leads him to go undercover as an aide to Falstaff to also try and foil Falstaff's plans. Then there is the added subplot of Anne Page, the daughter of Master and Mistress Page, who has 3 suitors. 2 that her parents approve of, but that she despises, and the one that she would accept, but that her father absolutely will not. And there are various machinations that they go through to try and unite or avoid one another. I have to say, I didn't really enjoy my reading of this play for a couple of reasons. First of all, the humor really did not translate in this play. It either relied on very obscure puns, even for someone who has read a lot of Shakespeare like myself, or it relied on a lot of physical comedy, like who's hiding in the closet, who's getting dumped in a river, who's dressed in women's clothing. When you're just reading about them, and that character is given very few lines to describe how they are feeling in this ridiculous situation, it doesn't really translate as funny. That and Anne Page's subplot and her relationship with Master Fenton, her preferred suitor, never really got much opportunity to demonstrate why they were well suited to one another. You understood why she didn't want Master Slender, because they were given opportunities to talk with one another, and he of course shows himself to be a fool. And she doesn't want to marry Dr. Caius because not only is he a fool, but he is much older than she is. So that's obvious from the outset. But we're never really given many opportunities for Anne and Fenton to talk together to find out why they like each other so much, apart from he is young and handsome and the lesser of three evils, really. So I thought to myself, well, I'll watch a version of the play instead, and maybe that will help the puns and the physical comedy become more clear. So the first version I watched was the 2019 production from the Globe Theatre. And I have to say, I liked this production possibly even less than reading the play. And I know that's a strong statement, but hear me out. I only made it about halfway through this production for a couple of reasons. First of all, they set it during the 1930s, and having that culture go on the stage of the Globe, which is so evocative, felt very out of place. So already I couldn't quite immerse myself in the action or believe in it enough. And the second reason was Falstaff's performance himself. Now, I don't remember the name of the actor who played Falstaff, unfortunately, and I'm sure he's a wonderful actor, but I don't think he was right for this part. First of all, he's a very small man, very slender, he doesn't look particularly tall, which he can't help, and that's perfectly fine, but it doesn't suit Falstaff. Falstaff, we know, is supposed to be big, both physically and everything that that represents, and in terms of his personality. Falstaff has an outsized personality, which is another reason that people either love him or hate him. So having a small man play him with rather a lazy, lackadaisical way of being full of himself doesn't suit the character at all, and thus doesn't make the comedy move forward. Because when he does get into trouble with the Pages and the Fords, someone who's quite laid back won't necessarily make a big deal out of being in those uncomfortable positions, which is of course what would make those scenes funny. So I gave up on the theatrical version about halfway through, but I suddenly had an idea. And so I moved on to watch the operatic version of The Merry Wives of Windsor, which is Falstaff by Giuseppe Verdi. And I watched the version from, I think, 2014 from the Metropolitan Opera. First of all, I was intrigued by the cast, as Lisette Oropesa plays Nanetta, or the equivalent of Anne Page. Stephanie Blythe played Mistress Quickly, and the noted Ambrogio Maestri was playing Falstaff. And yes, for those of you wondering, there are operatic versions of many of Shakespeare's plays. There are many different versions of Romeo and Juliet, for example. There are English language versions of The Tempest and A Midsummer Night's Dream by more modern composers. There's also a more modern composition of Hamlet, but performed in French. But Verdi loved Shakespeare, and he composed 3 adaptations of Shakespeare plays. being Macbeth, Otello, and Falstaff. And if you are intrigued by this, I would highly recommend that you check out the book Verdi's Shakespeare by Gary Wills. This is a wonderful book. It does go into the composition and performance history, which, if you're not musically inclined, may be a bit boring, but it also details how Verdi went about adapting these plays both into Italian and into an operatic form. And so I have to say that this production of Falstaff, I think, is the better, or indeed possibly the best version of The Merry Wives of Windsor, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it simplifies the plot a great deal. Master Slender and Master Shallow and all of those ancillary characters are cut down or eliminated altogether to really streamline the plot. But there are still the main plots and subplots which make Shakespeare interesting, and they all lean heavily on one another. Secondly, it solves the problem of not understanding Anne and Fenton's relationship, as the opera gives Fenton and Nanetta more time together so that you don't necessarily understand how they came to meet or why they are in love with one another, but you can understand the depth of their love for one another. Something that Anne does not have with Dr. Caius, who does still show up briefly. Thirdly, Ambrogio Maestri is a much better Falstaff. He is a physically big man. He is very tall. He is rather fat, but in all the best possible ways. And he is an incredibly jolly person. He loves to cook. He loves good wine. He loves people. He's very friendly. And so he embodies all of the good sides of Falstaff just as himself, thus playing up Falstaff's bad sides, or worse sides, is a little bit of acting, but he can also deeply empathize with Falstaff so that when Falstaff makes excuses for himself, you as the audience are also inclined to believe and forgive him, which is exactly what a good Falstaff should do. You should be annoyed with him, and you should know that he shouldn't be doing the things that he is, and yet he wins you over and makes you laugh all the same. There were several other things that I quite liked about this production. The music is very different than any other Verdi opera I've ever seen, and it was written towards the end of his life, so perhaps Verdi was getting a bit more experimental, a bit more daring than he was in his earlier days. But that really works in terms of how dialogue heavy an opera is. Very few people get true arias. Just as in the play, not many of the characters get full monologues or soliloquies. Many scenes involve lots of dialogue and people doing things or talking out a plan for doing something. The very odd style of music really does come to suit it, and as you really follow the dialogue, you tend to forget that the musical style is a bit different. This especially works towards the end with the scene in the forest. This is all to trick Falstaff, and there are people dressed up as fairies and elves to torture him to death, not quite literally. The music really makes that scene work far better than in the play, when suddenly people burst into a short little song, and then that's the end of it. I found that scene really works much better. There were places where, of course, Verdi cut and streamlined things, but he clearly has a huge love for Falstaff himself, as he was able to even work in an homage to Falstaff's honor speech from Henry IV, Part 1. Finally, the ending of the opera I thought was wonderful. Yes, of course, all parties get their comeuppance, and everything works out exactly as it should, but instead of ending on that note, with certain characters feeling quite triumphant, instead, Falstaff starts it, but soon all the characters fall in a fugue, which was quite outdated, but it really works. And the fugue is solely composed of the line, Tutto il mondo è burla, or all the world is a joke, which at the outset seems quite strange. But that is exactly the sort of thing that Falstaff would say in order to laugh off his own embarrassment. That all the world is a joke. But then the fugue stops partway through, and Falstaff looks out at the audience and says, all of you have been fooled. And then all the other characters join in on stage and start pointing into the audience. Everyone has been fooled, just like we have. And it turns into this chorus of laughter that ends the piece, which to my mind is such a genius thing to do, is to not only make it about one man's humiliation, but to point out everyone in this play was humiliated at one point or another, and haven't all of us gone through that same experience? So don't think yourselves all high and mighty, and that one line, those two lines, really get you thinking as you leave and go back into your own life. So for me, perhaps the loosest translation of the play is perhaps the best version of that play. So those are my jumbled thoughts on The Merry Wives of Windsor. If you have read it or if you have seen any of these versions, please let me know what you think in the comments down below, or if I gave you something to think about, or if in a few days you have gone off and watched a version yourself or read the play. Come back and tell me what you think. I would love to have a conversation with you all. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.